So the general plan will be three parts. First, we will begin with each of our guests speaking on how to put together a successful conference panel. From there, we will open the floor for any questions, do a Q&A session, and then finally, we'll move into smaller breakout rooms based on the information from the registration questionnaire that you filled out. And this will hopefully give people the opportunity to begin to construct early pieces of a potential panel. So with that, no further ado, I will go ahead and hand the floor over to Dr. Gidaszewski to get us started.
Hi, so actually I'm only the Assistant Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, NIU, for less than 20 hours, and then I stepped down. So, and that will end 9 years of the 14 that I've been at NIU, in which I've been either acting director, interim director, or assistant director. So end of an era. So you won't be seeing me anymore, which, as I've been around quite a lot the last year, may be a good thing. But I think you will be seeing me back in another iteration, and I will say more about that when the next academic year begins, probably. Okay, so I wanted to share my screen. I did a little PowerPoint. I'm obviously, and those of you who've seen me do some of these before, I'm not American, so I kind of bring a bit of an international perspective to how we do these things, and they're quite different in other places, mainly because in, say, the UK and Australia, we don't tend to have as many graduate students because we don't have the same kind of funding for graduate education as we see in the US, namely because in the UK and Australia, people don't want to put themselves in debt for several hundreds of thousands of dollars because we are much less likely to pay it off. So it's a kind of different approach. But where you do find PhD and master students who focus on Southeast Asia in Australia and the UK, and to a lesser extent in continental Europe, they are usually sort of the best of the best because they are the ones who have fought through thousands of people to get the sort of 5 PhD scholarships that do exist in countries. So it is a little bit different, but it is still worth reaching out to other places. And I'll say something about that at the end if people are trying to look for sort of really more diverse and inclusive approaches to putting panels together. So I think the rules for assembling a panel for a conference are pretty much the same as we would have for, a paper, putting a paper together. So I would say that you have to have one of these 3 criteria: approaching new evidence in an old way, old evidence in a new way, which is mainly about methodology and technology, or pairing old evidence with old approaches in a new way, and that's mainly comparative. And on top of that, for a panel, as opposed to just a paper, you have to have a variety of disciplinary, geographical, and/or institutional perspectives. So there can be a lot of moving parts, and some of them have to come together in some kind of connected way in order for it to work. So what do I mean by this? So new evidence in an old way. So if, we've had received wisdom about, say, the chronology of a place, or how, the first time 2 different geopolitical entities came together, well, we might have new evidence that refutes that. So putting a panel together that uses new evidence, using old, received methodologies is really cool. So a panel, for example, that uses content analysis to explore the patterns in some, say, new recordings of meetings between Sukarno and Hatta, right? So we haven't had this body of evidence before. So we would use an old method, media content analysis, to explore this new material and then say, this contributes to an argument in different ways. Or a panel that discusses a newly excavated site, a maritime shipwreck, for example, with Roman coins dating to much earlier than we ever anticipated Roman coins were in a particular part of Indonesia, right? So that would be new evidence in an old way. So those kinds of approaches are often really exciting. Old evidence in a new way. So this happens a lot with archaeology because of new technologies that come along, and we're able to look at things in new ways. So a panel exploring how the kingdoms of the modern Khmer were connected using LiDAR technology. So you might have a bunch of different archaeologists who are working in different places in Southeast Asia, but using the same kind of technology like LiDAR, which basically is a new kind of penetrating ground radar that lets us sort of see archaeological artifacts underneath the soil. or a panel that uses artificial intelligence to restore missing fragments of inscriptions across Southeast Asia, which would be really exciting as well. So new way, but still the same kinds of topics that have been looked at before. And then finally, old evidence with old approaches in a new way. So Kakawin texts from Bali and Java, which have been looked at before, comparing the number of loan words in them from Sanskrit, which has been done before, but using something like OCR technology in PDFs to pick up perhaps more frequencies than were used before. So all these are 3 examples of ways that panels can sort of be very interesting for conferences and tend to be picked up. And then the 4th criteria, you kind of need to have a range of either different disciplines. So you might have on a panel a sociologist, an anthropologist, and 2 political scientists, which sounds like the start of a joke about them all walking into a bar, but I promise you does happen in real life. Geographical, so not focusing just on one country, and instead having, for example, with my LiDAR technology one, well, okay, let's have an archaeologist who does Cambodia, one who does Bali, one who does Myanmar, one who does Vietnam, and then institutional. So this tends to be not only different universities, so you could have a PhD student from NIU, a full professor from Michigan State, an assistant professor from Berkeley, and then maybe someone from outside as well who might not necessarily be in academia, depending on the kind of topic, or different institutions with several assistant and associate professors also works as well. So as long as you kind of are mixing up the levels there, that tends to work. For a graduate student panel, definitely having probably at least 2 different institutions represented would probably be a good idea in terms of being picked up. And then I put together just some ideas. If people are interested in reaching out beyond the US, obviously our Southeast Asian counterparts who we are probably already all in contact with, but also people don't tend to think about these places as much. The Asian Studies Association of Australia, or the ASAA, EuroCS, which is the European Association for Southeast Asian Studies, they're having their annual conference in Amsterdam this year in August. The International Convention of Asia Scholars, and ASIASUC, the Association for Southeast Asian Studies in the United Kingdom. So all of these places have websites, and they often have sort of lists of who, current graduate students and where they are. So you would be able to locate them. A lot of them would allow you to kind of put a call for papers on their website or in their newsletter for free. But they also tend to list any current conferences that are upcoming. They list people who are in there and their affiliations and their past conference programs as well, if you're looking for a particular kind of person to join your panel. And then finally, this is what I show all of my graduate students. The formula for an abstract. So generally 1 or 2 sentences that explain the topic, purpose, and any particular research question. Another couple of sentences talking about methodology. So, using materials from the Fonds de Résidence Supérieure of the National Archives of Cambodia, we intend to, etc. Or this is the social history. This will be an environmental history panel. And then sort of a teaser showing like what your conclusions are, but being very vague about it, so people actually want to attend the panel. And future paths after this panel might lead in this direction, which tend to be good. And so this is the one that we did for the AAS this year. And this is actually an example of approaching old evidence in a new way. So we have the same archival material, but instead of looking at Cambodia as a sideshow to the conflict in Vietnam during the Cold War, we instead looked at Cambodia more as kind of an entity in a global kind of paradigm of transnational solidarities beyond just sort of the Soviet bloc and the West. Instead, we looked at the neutral places and where particularly support was coming from. So from the Black Panthers, for example, and that kind of thing. So old evidence in a new way. So those are kind of the tips that I would give any of my graduate students. So I hope that this might be useful for people sort of just getting some ideas going about how you might want to approach putting a panel together yourself. That's that. I will stop sharing. I will try to stop sharing. Can someone force me to stop sharing, Ava?
I can do that. Hold on.
Thank you.
Theoretically, I can. There we go.
There we go.
All right, I think it's over to me now. Thanks, everybody. My name is Tom Pepinsky, and I'll be sharing some thoughts. I think what I'm going to say today is, and I apologize for not having put PowerPoint together. What I'm going to say today is going to be, I think, quite complementary to what Trude has shared with us just now. But I'm going to emphasize a different set of questions or a different set of issues that you may be facing as you're considering submitting a panel for AAS or for any other disciplinary conference. And so I'm going to talk about 5 things. I'm going to talk about timing, rules, norms, coherence, and expectations. And the other thing I'll say, though, as a kind of way of prefacing this, is to emphasize something that Trude led on, but I'll say a little bit more explicitly. Why would you submit a panel to AAS or to any other disciplinary conference? Well, the main reason why you do this is that's how you get on the program in the first place. It's important to recognize that as a graduate student or an early career researcher, being able to participate in conferences is something you can do by just attending them. But what you're often looking for is a way to highlight your own research and to put the spotlight on yourself. It's presenting a paper at a conference is the type of thing that allows you to get your name out there. It brings some visibility to you, and it allows you to be part of the professional community, not just as a consumer or an interlocutor, but as a producer of knowledge. And so I take the basic. I think it's important to just say explicitly, this is why this is a good idea to do, because you want to have a chance to make yourself part of the scholarly community as a producer of research and to draw the attention to yourself. Now, it's often the case, I think this is normally the case at AAS as well, but other conferences I attend as well. There's 2 ways to get on the program. One is to just submit a paper and see if it's accepted, and the other is to organize a panel. The secret is, it is much easier to get on the program if you organize a panel than if you submit an individual paper. It is just way easier. In the course of my career, have organized the conference programs for the American Political Science Association twice. And so I can tell you a little bit, and I'll share a little bit later about like what that process is like from the other side. And I can tell you that the basic issue is that there's all these proposals that are submitted to you, and you have to make panels. And so your question as an organizer or a program chair is, would I rather make panels out of individual submissions and hope that they cohere, or would I rather just take a made panel and just put it on the program? The hit rate for submissions to the American Political Science Association's annual meeting is about 17%, according to the data that I have. If for individual paper submissions, for panel submissions, it's about 90%. So it's just a lot easier to do. The numbers are going to differ a little bit in the case of AAS due to different constituencies and different norms. But this is the secret. If you want to maximize your likelihood of being on the program, you got to get on a panel. And if there's not a panel that's coming out to ask you to be on it, you should just organize one yourself. So with that in mind, let me talk about a couple of things that you may be thinking of right now. So AAS next year will be taking place in March in Columbus, Ohio. Scenic Columbus, one of the top three biggest cities in Ohio, I suppose. You may be thinking, okay, March 2025, I'm not ready to think about this right now. Well, I'm here to tell you that the call for papers and the program announcement is going to be going out soon. And so the time for you to start thinking about putting together a panel is now. It is not something you want to pull together right before the deadline when things are due. And it's also not something that you want to think is a fast process. I'm going to talk about a little concretely what you'll need to do to put together a panel, but the time to start thinking about it is now, because the deadline is going to be coming up sooner than you think. The reason why you want to think about this now sort of mechanically is because if you wish to have a group of papers and presenters ready to go by the deadline, you need to give them and yourself at least a month to be contacting and emailing people. So given that the program announcement is going to be made, according to the website, which I just checked, it's going to be made in early June, and the deadline is going to be in just a couple months. Now's the time to think about this. So concretely, what you need to do is decide, based on Trude's very, very helpful guidelines, which I have no comments about those are just really smart, is to decide how you would like to structure a panel by identifying potential participants through a number of different ways. But you want to be thinking about finding a list of people to participate in your panel in ways that allow you to achieve the objectives that Trude has specified here. I guess the only amendment that I'd make to Trude's suggestion is that she is showing you unusually good panels and unusually diverse ones. I think that if you hit diversity on all of those dimensions, you are in really good shape. I don't think it's often possible to have a thematically coherent panel that has that much variation in country focus, and geography, and institution, and discipline, and position. It's if you can get 2 out of those 4, I think that's pretty good. But you do need to have, I think, Trude, you should jump in and tell me if you think this is about right. Minimum, you need diversity on 1. Probably you need diversity on 2. I think that's probably the necessary in order to have a fair shot at being accepted.
Sorry, I'm sorry if I was confusing there, but I realized we didn't have much time. I didn't mean for everyone to get all of them, as you say, of those 4, probably 2 is as much as anyone can hope for. But I do know that, say, anyone submitting a panel proposal on just, say, 200 years of the Han Dynasty with only Chinese historians is unlikely to get picked up. They need a little bit more diversity to make it appealing to wider audiences.
That's right. And I think we can share, because we're a room full of mostly, I think exclusively people who work on Southeast Asia, that for us, it's the demands on geographic and substantive diversity are just larger, right? Like you might be able to get away with Qing history, only historians, because it's in the China part of the program. Southeast Asia, we generally don't have that luxury. We have to be diverse, and so that's good. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I think are like essential forms of diversity, but you want to be thinking now because you want to be deliberate about putting together panels that achieve those dimensions of diversity. The great thing about Trude introducing you so explicitly to what those are is you can think explicitly about them for yourself. And I would caution you not to make this a kind of afterthought. But okay, so we're going to think about putting together a panel. And what does that mean? At some level, either you are going to have to contact scholars who you wish to appear on the panel with you, or you are going to have to make aware your attempt to organize a panel and have others come to you. So there's 2 models. Either you could just do it yourself, sit down and plan, make your dream list and email people, or you can put out a call for papers for a panel and have people respond. In my experience, the former model gives you more control over the process than the latter model. The latter model is more common in disciplines, I think, that are more disciplines that are interdisciplinary. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but perhaps you know what I mean. Disciplines in which interdisciplinarity is more common, or in which a diversity of methodological and theoretical perspectives is required. Those are the disciplines in which a call for proposals is going to be more useful, perhaps. It's going to identify people you hadn't thought of previously. In my own experience, working as a political scientist, often it'll be a panel with only political scientists on it. We must achieve our diversity some other way. But in that case, I am normally picking people I wish to invite and contacting them directly. But like the hard thing about it is if you want a call for proposals, you need to be thinking about this last week. the week before in order to be able to meet the deadlines that are coming up, because you need to get this out, and then you need to get responses, you need people to think about it. There's just a lot of things that have to happen. Okay, so the first thing we've talked about is the fact that you need to invite people. And that normally happens from your perspective by just sending emails to people you may know and some people you may not know and inviting them to participate in a panel. I want to say, you may be asking yourself, why would anybody say yes to an invitation to appear on a panel with me, some graduate student who, maybe you're thinking nobody knows who I am or something like that? Let me tell you, the answer is because faculty are lazy and they would rather you organize a panel than do it themselves. And you will be surprised. If the person intends to go to AAS and has not yet figured out how they're going to go to AAS, you have given them a special gift by giving them a chance to go to AAS without having to think about proposing their own panel. So this really is important. This is something that you can really do, and people really will say yes. The challenge is that you have to ask them first, and they may not. Somebody may have asked them before you did, and so. I'll say, just don't think too hard about whether or not somebody says no for a good reason or a bad reason. People are busy. Maybe they've already been invited. Maybe they're not going that year. They already know that. But there's not much harm to asking, and I think you are likely to get responses that are positive when you do the inviting. So, with that in mind, let's talk now about my second thing, and I promise I'm not going to go on too much longer. Let's talk about what I think are some rules. Some of these rules are explicit. Some of these are not explicit. AAS and other professional organizations may have rules written down that you can go look for. And the rules are going to vary by year and by conference and by discipline. So a little bit of this is uncertain, but I think generally it's the case that some of the things that Trude mentioned as dimensions of diversity are basically rules. You cannot expect success at AAS if you only invite one type of person, right? And specifically, don't think you're going to get into the program if your proposal is all white men. It's just not going to happen, and it probably shouldn't. I think that's probably appropriate. Diversity in terms of background is essential. I have published articles in political science on what we call manels. You know what a manel is? A manel is a panel made entirely of men. There is an emerging norm in my discipline that people will not participate in manels. And I think that you should anticipate as you're planning don't try to construct a manel. First off, people may not participate in it. And second off, even if they do agree, it is unlikely to be accepted. And so these are sort of rules. AAS also has historically had specific instructions about what other forms of diversity are required for participation for a panel. They may include things like variation in the rank. So you can't only have full professors, or you can't only have graduate students. That is sometimes a rule, but even if it's not a rule, it's a good norm. Trude is correct. You want diversity in backgrounds, you want diversity in ranks as much as possible. And there are, I think it's fair to say that you may find that if you propose a panel that is too monochromatic on these dimensions, it may just not even be considered. It may just not make it on the program at all. And so that's something to keep in mind. Those are things to avoid. I expect that we don't have to all be told this, but we're just to make sure, let's be intentional about it. We want to make sure that our panels are diverse and the people that we're involving are not only the most famous people or the most prominent people or the most established people, right? This brings me to my third point. This has a Janus phase, like another side of this, which is that, let's talk about what are things that you can do in terms of pure panel composition that can increase your likelihood of being accepted. If you're a PhD student in particular, a panel with other PhD students is really good, but it often will be more likely to be accepted if you can involve one or two prominent members of our field, right? And for better or for worse, program chairs are tasked with the responsibility to assemble panels that they think that people will want to attend. And to the extent to which they believe that having a famous person on the panel increases their likelihood of people attending the panel, then this is a politic thing to do. It's just a thing that you can do. I also think that being intentional about, we'll talk in a second about coherence, but being intentional about writing a panel abstract that describes an exciting thing to talk about, like why people should be excited about it, is really good. Of course, excitement and what is exciting is in the eye of the beholder, and there are disciplinary differences which are going to be important for you to keep in mind. But you want to ask yourself, how do I write this abstract in ways that get people to read it and want to attend it? Because that is what the actual program organizer has to do, is figure out what are the ones that people are going to want to attend. So these are things that'll increase your likelihood of being accepted. Diversity in rank makes a big difference. Diversity in other characteristics makes a big difference. All these things make it more likely, even if there's no specific rule that says you have to create panels like this. The next thing I want to talk about, and this is 4 out of 5, I promise, is coherence. So how do you make a coherent panel? Those of you who have attended AAS before, or who have attended other professional organizations, have probably encountered a situation in which somebody says, I intended to write a different paper than the one that I've actually written, or the project that I promised to do when I agreed to be on the panel is not something that I can actually deliver. And so the coherence of the panel, when it actually appears at AAS or the other conference, is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about getting together people at the front end in order to get it accepted. Obviously, you would like to have a coherent panel that is coherent when it's formed and coherent when it's actually delivered at the conference, but you can only control the former. You can't really control the latter. And even when a panel isn't as coherent as people would perhaps prefer, it's normally not. This isn't a deal breaker. You can still have a great experience anyway. So how do you achieve how to achieve coherence, and how much should you obsess about it? I think you should not. You shouldn't obsess about it in the sense of delimiting a narrow thing and then demanding that everybody participate by writing specifically like in response to a prompt or something like that. I do think, though, that this is an opportunity for you to look around in your corner of our field, in your corner of your discipline, your corner of your area, and think about, are there emerging themes that people are writing about already that I also want to write about? Or is there a thing that has happened, or a problem that's out there, or a discourse which is emerging, however you want to think about it, which is broadly interesting that people can have different perspectives on? It need not, and I don't think I've ever had a panel that was as coherent as Trude's panels. It's normally like, what's going on in Indonesian democracy right now? It's something like that. And that's about as coherent as I've ever had, and I think that's okay. So I don't think you need to obsess about coherence. You do need to obsess, though, about how you can articulate what hangs this thing together for the point of submission, so that people know when they're forming the program how to pick it. And so we can talk more about tips there going as needed. But I'm going to stop here with my last point, which is about expectations. Now, we are sort of messing with the system. I think that for the longest time, nobody really knew how to do panels or how to create panels, and there's no generally shared advice that anybody had. So what that meant is that the likelihood of knowing how to submit a panel was unequally distributed across people. And so certain sorts of people knew how to do it, other people didn't know how to do it. What we're trying to do here today is share this with all of you. In the short term, that's going to make it more likely, I hope, that your panels are accepted at AAS. In the long term, it's going to make it less likely that anybody's panels are accepted at AAS, because we're going to have more and more people who know how to submit. And for a fixed amount of possible acceptances, the acceptance rate is going to be lower. But forget about that problem for now, because we're thinking about your career and your timeline. And so what we want to do is think about how to get your proposals in. I just want you to know that making panels is hard, or making a conference program is hard, and you have to make really gut-wrenching choices. And those gut-wrenching choices can be experienced by you, the panel submitter or the paper submitter, as like a statement about the quality or the interest or the value or the validity of your work. Please hear me when I tell you that that's not in the first instance what's going on. If your paper or your panel is not accepted, it's normally because it's just really hard to choose and sacrifices have had to be made. And I want you not to think that this is a commentary on you. I've had many papers rejected from conferences. That still happens with some frequency. I've had panel proposals rejected from conferences. This still happens with some frequency. So it can happen to you, and it's not your fault, and it's not necessarily something that you've done wrong. But the purpose of doing what Trude and I have done so far, and Chris is going to help as well as our third speaker, is to give you tips on how to make it more likely that you can get in. We can't guarantee you acceptance. There's no formula we can write down that has an answer for how to do it. But if you think about the dimensions of diversity and coherence that Trude shared, and you think about deliberately putting together the panel in the way that I've talked about, like really thinking about how to plan the timing, giving people time to write, giving people time to propose things, and you to write a compelling abstract, I think you're going to have a good chance of being accepted. And then that will be great, because then you can be the star, and that's what we're here for. Final comment, which I didn't talk about, is like, what is a chair? What is a discussant? Okay. AAS panels have rules that there can be 4 papers maximum and 1 chair required, and a discussant. A chair is the person who keeps the time and is nominally in charge of it. The chair can be the same person as one of the paper presenters at AAS. The chair can also be the same person as the discussant. There are other people who are happy to just be the chair. What does that mean? That means that they can apply for funding from their university and attend the conference without having to do anything except for tell people to only talk for 10 minutes and then tell them when their 10 minutes are up. Some people are happy to just do that. I would say that discussant is the most important part of an AAS panel, actually. The papers are great. Of course, they're important. And if the chair doesn't keep time, that's a problem. But the discussant has the opportunity to guide the room through its consumption and evaluation of the papers as they've been presented. So I think that discussant is a really serious role. I think it's a mark of honor. I think it's a mark of authority. I think it's something that you should ask to do if you can. Most people find it annoying to be asked to be discussant, because basically you're asking them to read a whole bunch of people's papers and prepare comments, and that's not why they may be there. So just be aware, even though I think discussant's really important, if you invite somebody to be a discussant, you are making a request of them, and some people may not want to do that. And please do not make your panel diverse by putting the only woman on the panel in the discussant role, which is kind of like giving them the worst job and asking them to get no credit for it. That said, let's all remember discussant is an important role. And if we treat discussant as a valued contribution to the community rather than an onerous burden to be done, then hopefully in the long term, people will all understand that this is an important part of the discipline as well, and it won't be seen as an onerous burden. Okay, with that, I've gone on far too long. I'll turn it over to Chris. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to come at this in a little bit different direction than Trude and Tom, because I am a different person. I'm a grad student. Trude and Tom are both very well-established scholars. They have big names in the field, whereas myself, many in the audience, nobody knows who we are. So the process of putting together a panel might be a little bit more difficult. So I'm going to go through 3 steps of what I've done in order to make that seemingly difficult, insurmountable process quite a bit easier. Because once you break it down, as long as you give yourself enough time to do so, it becomes much more manageable. And once you have the panel together, it's, as Tom mentioned, much more likely to get into the conference. So it is the ideal way to go about this, as opposed to just submitting a paper. Now, the first part of that, which is going to be the most difficult aspect of putting together a panel for younger, earlier stage scholars, is simply where do you find people? How do you find people? As our networks are not as well established, right? Where Trude and Tom might know a lot of people, I certainly don't know as many people in the field yet. So to do this, I really think that there's 3 steps that could be utilized from a grad student perspective that are very helpful. First, and it's easy to say, but it should not be left unsaid, do utilize any network that you have. Now, this step for us is not going to create a full panel, most likely. But you may know people, whether they're in your field, outside of your field, studying different regions, you do know people. And if you could grab at least one of them, that's already half of a panel. So think about it that way. You have yourself, you have one other person in your network, and you're halfway there. And at this stage, you don't need to be extremely focused. You could simply be looking at, I want to go to this conference. I want to make a panel. I found person B. Now that you have half the panel, depending on what you two are doing, you can start to kind of focus in on what this panel could be about. For example, AAS in Asia, in Jakarta, in a month and a half, I had somebody approach me, a friend, to create a panel, and he is working on Turkey and Japan relations. I'm in Indonesia, so seemingly, wow, we can't be in a panel together. That's so different. But since we started there, we're able to construct a panel that did work and did get into the conference. So start there. If you can get one person, you are halfway there, and it's a really great place to start. Now, from there, as a graduate student, I typically would go for those broad calls for panel members, something that Trude mentioned. And there's many places that you can make a broad open call. As Trude mentioned, there's different associations that may help you put it into their newsletter. Those associations, and even the conference holders themselves, are often very willing to help on social media. Often there's hashtags. Sometimes they'll retweet or share Facebook, Instagram posts. You also have listservs, right? Many organizations, many regional studies will have a listserv, right? Which, if you don't know what a listserv is, it's basically a group of people that come together, and you can email out and it goes to everybody. And then somebody replies and it goes to everybody. So for an example, TLC, the regional organization for Thai, Lao, Cambodia studies, they have a listserv. So if you were looking for members that might be working on one of those 3 countries, you could send it out on the TLC listserv. Another great place that I've utilized is HNet, which, if you're not familiar, HNet is a website with a bunch of sub-websites for disciplines, regional studies, things like that. So there's an HNet for Southeast Asia studies, there's an HNet for US foreign relations, an HNet for Asia studies, so forth. And basically, people just post things to the HNet, call for papers, events, release, pretty much whatever, and people receive that information when they signed up. So you can go in to, say, the HNet subcategory for Southeast Asia, if you're looking for a panel of Southeast Asianists, and say, hey, putting together a panel, so on and so forth. And you want to keep those broad calls not too specific. So ideally, you have a general idea. You can give a good idea of what you're looking for, so you're not just like grabbing anybody like in step 1. But you don't want to be overly specific so that people don't think that they fit. You want to get people to contact you. So they email you, hopefully you get another person. Maybe you get 2 and your panel's done. And that would let you move into the last step. So let's say at this point you have 3 people out of 4, you're looking for that 4th person. That's when you go into cold calling, contacting specific scholars that, as a graduate student, they might not necessarily be in your network, right? It's not as easy as that first step where you ask somebody and you discuss with somebody you know. Now, I always leave this for last, because if you are contacting somebody, let's say I email Tom Pepinsky and I say, Tom, would you like to be in my panel? Now, if I started with that and I say, Tom, would you like to be in a panel? I'm doing this. I don't really know about the panel. Hopefully it works out. Tom only has one chance to be in a panel in AAS. Is he really going to hedge his bets with a student that he doesn't know that just like wants to make a panel? Whereas if you have things together well enough, say you have 3 out of 4 people, you can say, hey, Tom, we have 3 out of 4 people for this panel. We're looking for the 4th member. This is what the panel is about. I think it works really well with your research to focus, so on and so forth. Tom can look at the panel and think, that's pretty cohesive. It works with a few things that the AAS coordinators will be looking for. It works within what I would like to talk about. And it makes it much, much easier for him to say yes. Because as he mentioned, if he can say yes, get on a panel that he thinks is going to get in, easiest path for him to present at the conference. So save that for last, because you want to really have something tangible and cohesive by the time you start cold calling scholars that likely are further along in their career than you, that likely might not know who you are or who else is on the panel. Give them something substantive to say yes to. So the second thing I want to talk about is after creating the panel, once you already have your 4 people, how can you finagle those individual abstracts and then the panel abstract as a whole to fit cohesively together as a unit, right? That would be accepted. And if there is one, possibly fit the conference theme as a whole. Now, large conferences often don't really have a theme that you need to stick to. Lots of other conferences, regional conferences, things like that, oftentimes will have a theme. So sometimes if you can kind of your panel to that theme just a little bit, it can make it a lot more attractive to the conference organizers. For example, again, that AAS in Asia, they had a theme of global Asias. So what I did with our abstracts was simply to focus on, oh yeah, this is a global Asias panel. For example, my friend with Turkey and Japan, hey, Turkey influences on Japan. I was doing something with Britain and Indonesia. Hey, Britain and Indonesia. We found other people that were utilizing some sort of international aspect. Great. Let's focus on that. That's our thing. That's our something. So the first thing that I'll do is make sure that each one of our panel members knows that theme that we're kind of constructing the panel on. So that way, when they write their abstracts, they can have that in mind. And if things are a little misaligned, out of topic, you can kind of align them with the abstracts, right? Because keep in mind, when you give your 10, 15 minutes, whatever it may be, presentation, things can sometimes be a little bit less aligned, right? But you do want to make sure on paper, everything is cohesive and aligned. That's very important. So once I have everyone's abstracts, we'll go into creating that focused panel abstract. So for those who don't know, we all have our individual papers. 90% of the time, you have to have a very clear panel abstract as well that brings everything together if you want to get accepted. So with those 4 abstracts in hand, you can start to construct that panel abstract, which you want to keep to a singular theme. And you want to touch 1 line per speaker, maybe 1 line for 2 speakers together, something along that lines, something very short that addresses this person is connected to our theme. This person's paper looks at this, which is connected to our theme, and so forth. It's your opportunity to not just allow the conference organizers to read the individual abstracts and decide for themselves if it's aligned. You are telling them it is aligned and this is how it's aligned. So once you make that panel abstract, that allows you to go back, share that with the whole group, and make any small revisions to individual abstracts. Now, obviously, you want to go about that gently, and you want to emphasize small changes. You can't just change somebody's entire topic. But oftentimes, if you add a line, if you change, a subtopic of this, just small tweaks, you can start to align the individual abstracts with the panel abstract, so everything really meshes together and it really feels like a panel that should be put together. Even if you started, now this is all after the fact, you might have put together these disparate scholars and it's like, this kind of goes together. We'll do what we can. But once you're putting it on paper, you can word things and frame things in a way that it really feels like it fits together. And then once you have that, you can go to your final stage before applying, which is really putting in those final touches to bring things together. An easy way is titles, right? Especially the whole panel title, which you can really make that fit. So for an example, again, I'm just using the same conference, AAS in Asia, that Global Asia's theme. I put the word Global Asia in the panel title. I mean, it's a little heavy-handed. You don't always have to do that. But you have those little cherries on top that you can use. It's also the time where you can go and look for a discussant and or a chair. As Tom had mentioned quite a bit about chairs and discussants, they are a different level of responsibility. You want to keep that in mind. So when you do reach out to people, one thing that I have had success utilizing is a method where I'm looking for a chair and a discussant, and it's going to be somebody that's larger in the field, somebody that would bring real name recognition to the panel. I will be direct with them that we think that you're an expert in this field. You'd be a perfect addition. It's more likely to get accepted, and we would love to have you as the chair and or discussant. Now, obviously, discussant has a lot of responsibilities. So if that's something that you cannot manage, we would still love to have you as the chair. So that way I'm not pushing them into the discussant role, as it is a lot of work. And I'm giving them that out to allow them to be just the chair itself. And then if they want to be the chair and the discussant, that's perfect. You can certainly do that. Done it before. It's a wonderful opportunity. And during that stage, it also gives you a chance to take another look at, as Tom and Trude have discussed, diversification of the panel. Maybe it's all grad students, so you definitely want to have a non-grad student as your discussant chair. Maybe everybody is from 2 universities. Okay, we definitely need to get somebody from a 3rd university. Maybe all 4 of our panelists are from Indonesian universities. Okay, let's get a chair from a non-Indonesian university, something like that. It gives you the chance, and not to just have like a token scholar or something like that, but to actually, when you're looking at a discussant role, adding a set of diversification outside of the panel can be extremely valuable for the discussion as a whole, and the panel organizers know that. So it gives you the chance to really add that little flair, not only to the substance of the panel, but actually your application itself. So keep that in mind. And finally, quickly, I would like to just discuss of what to do when everything goes wrong with your panel. Because as we mentioned, it's not an easy process. As Tom pushed forward, you need to start early. And obviously it can take time. It can take time doing open calls. It can take time. You might ask a scholar to come onto the panel. 2 weeks later, they say no, you ask somebody else. It's a process. And as an early stage scholar, student, the chances of things going wrong are much higher than, say, if you're Trude or Tom and you know enough people, you have the name recognition. You might not be very optimized. Maybe you have what you might consider yourself a weak panel. You don't know if this is going to be accepted. So my suggestion is to just send it in, submit it. It does not hurt. Every application, whether it's for a conference, grant, fellowship, whatever it may be, it's all a roll of the dice. Now, if you're rolling the dice, you want to do everything you can to take a 20-sided die, 1 in 20 chance, and get it into a 6-sided die, a 1 in 6 chance, or even a flip of a coin, a 1 out of 2 chance. You want to optimize your odds. But regardless, even if it's a 90% chance of getting accepted, there still is a random chance that you don't get accepted. So with that said, if you don't get accepted, you're not in any worse place than you were if you did not submit. If you do not submit, you do not talk at the conference. If you submit and get rejected, you do not speak at the conference. It's the same result. So it does not hurt to submit the panel. And if the ultimate failure of putting a panel together of like, it just doesn't work out, you can't get a panel together, submit your individual paper. As Tom mentioned, it's way worse odds, but that doesn't mean that it won't work. You're basically hoping that a couple other individual papers fit within an easy panel that the conference organizers can easily put together and throw out there. So throw it out. And the worst case scenario, again, your individual paper doesn't get accepted. It's not a big deal. So at the end of the day, and I really had to focus that one because I've thrown in applications numerous times that I thought, you know, worth a shot. And they got accepted. You just never know. You really never know. So don't give up. Don't be dismayed if things don't go as planned, and give it a try anyways. So with that, I am done with my spiel. Did Tom or Trude want to add anything before we go to Q&A session?
I'd just like to say that Trude and Chris are very wise, and you should listen to everything they have to say also. There's a ton of great advice here.
Thanks, Tom. So with that, I would like to open the floor to Q&A. You're welcome to raise your hand. You're welcome to throw the mute button off. You're welcome to ask a question any way that you really want to ask. No need to be too formal.
We've said too much.
You said too much. Okay. Want to give people a moment to think if you need to. So just to preview what we'll be doing after a possible Q&A session, is that we will break into smaller rooms for breakout rooms based on what people put into their registration. And hopefully that gives you a chance to start to network a little bit. And even if you find one person that potentially could be a panel, you're halfway there. So keep that in mind. So we do have one question from Thera Thun in the chat. So feel free to write them in the chat as well if you'd like. Thanks to all speakers. Could you talk a bit more about the characteristics of panels that are likely to get rejected by the AAS?
So for Tiara Soksabai Lokru, I think probably the main thing is those categories I was talking about, making sure that at least one or two of them are not completely homogenous. So when I was the person deciding what panels got accepted for the ASAA conference in 2009, 8 or 9, we rejected panels that were all on China. We rejected panels that were all on South Asia. We rejected panels that were not diverse in terms of having all men. And again, this is the ASAA, it's not the AAS, so it's a smaller conference, but not by much. We normally have 500 to 700 in Australia, or at least we did. I haven't lived there for quite some time, as everyone knows. So I think just having some kind of, I mean, I did just have at the AAS a conference that was all on Cambodia during the Cold War. So I made a lot of, I contravened a lot of rules that the AAS has there, but the reason we were able to get away with it was 2 of them were PhD students. I'm a full professor and a woman, and we had one person who, although having been a previous PhD student of mine and who had previously gone to NIU, now is an assistant professor at a different university. So that was enough diversity in kind of the makeup of the panel, so that the fact that the temporal period and the geographical focus were very narrow. So I would say that is kind of what you need to aim for, things that are just not very diverse in one way or another.
The only thing I'd add to this is it is often the case that you can read an abstract of a paper or a panel which is aspirational rather than concrete, or that conveys an intent to do research and write it up rather than the fact of having done research and written it up. I would encourage you to, regardless of the level of completeness of your submission, you want to give the program organizer or the person selecting the panels a good reason to believe that what has been proposed is going to be implemented. And you'd be surprised by, there's like a negative signal that is sent when it is very much, we will be, this paper plans to study X, or this paper intends to do research on Y. You're looking for they don't want hopes and dreams about papers or presentations. They want things that are going to be implemented. And so I mean, that is the most non-obvious thing that I think differentiates accepted from unaccepted things. I'll also note that, like, I just in case everybody didn't hear Trude's important caveat that ASAA and AAS are a little bit different. Country-specific panels at AAS are not impossible, and like that is something that can happen if the focus on other dimensions, if it's really focused and coherent thematically, but it really maximizes the variation in other dimensions. So like if you want to write about the Thai monarchy or something like that, that's okay. Like a panel on that is okay. Certainly that is doable. I think it might be more likely to be accepted if it's about monarchies in mainland Southeast Asia, for example, but it's not impossible.
That was great information that I have nothing to add to because I don't select panels. I'm just a grad student. So moving on to a question that I might be able to help with, Enren Du, thank you to the speakers. You mentioned that all grad student panels was still possible to get into an AAS. Is this still true? They've got suggestions that AAS panels should always have senior scholars. And if I could tackle that from a graduate student perspective first, I would say that it's 100% possible. I've done it. I've done it twice. Shame on me, but I have done it. And one thing that you might consider doing, as I mentioned, when you put in the final touches of your panel, is to grab that senior scholar, grab somebody that's really well known in the field, very knowledgeable, for chair and or discussant role. Now, this is going to help in two ways. One, they just know more than us. They're better at this than us. They've been doing it longer. So they'll be able to bring things together during the discussion in ways that grad students possibly won't be able to. They'll be able to add comments from a deeper pool of knowledge that we may not be able to. And then on the application, it does put a large name. So in a way, that chair and discussant is telling the conference organizers, hey, these 4 grad students have their stuff together. This is a good panel. I'm putting my name on it. You should accept it. And when they see that person saying that, they're likely to accept it. So like for the last one, we had grad students and asked Kevin Fogg, a very prominent scholar of religion in Indonesia, and he accepted being the chair and discussant. So the organizers are going to see, oh, Kevin Fogg thinks this is a good panel. Well, we certainly do as well. If Kevin Fogg thinks this is a good panel, we do. And that is a way to get past that. So it is possible. Anything else, Tom or Trude, before we move on?
It might be useful to sometimes in your abstract mention that if it's all graduate student panels and these are, you can lean into that a little bit. You can say, this is an all graduate student panel. I don't think that works in the converse. I don't think all professor panel is a great move, but all graduate student panel, if if it's real, that can be attractive to mention.
Perfect. I saw a hand go up before I call on you. If you'd still like to ask your question, the hand went down. We did have another typed in question that came in first.
Hi.
Oh, hi. Go ahead, Laura.
Hi.
Please
Sorry.
ask.
So my name is Laras. I'm a PhD student at Pitt Law, University of Pittsburgh. So Ohio is close to Pittsburgh. So I'm kind of very excited to join the next AAS. So my question is, in some conference, we are allowed to send more than one abstract. Is it possible, for instance, to get higher chance to get accepted? Like I also submit a panel and I also send a personal abstract. Is it possible? So that's my question.
Yeah, I'll take that question. You can certainly submit more than one abstract. There may be a limit to how many proposals you can do. So I'd check that to make sure that you're not submitting too many. I also think that, and I just can't imagine there'd be more than 2 viable submissions that you have that would be competitive. The important thing is that what you can do at the conference does depend on the rules. AAS, you can only be accepted to present a paper at 1. And so you can submit more, and it increases perhaps your likelihood to get selected for 1, but you can't get 3 papers in AAS, even if you wanted to, even if they were accepted. I'd also say that, so this is an opportunity to answer another question from Marley about, can someone be on one panel giving a paper and also be a chair or discussant on another panel? Yes, I think that is the only participation rule which is allowed that would enable you to be on 2 panels, but you can do no more than 1 paper, which I think is the more important thing.
Thank you.
Next question from Immaculata Kriniasanti. What if one of the speakers is an undergraduate student? In their potential panel, they have a full professor, a PhD student, an activist with MA background, and an undergraduate student. What do you think with this composition?
So it's hard to speak in the abstract. Certainly that is not something that would be ruled out because you've done something wrong, right? I do think, however, that I would be careful about featuring an undergraduate on the panel if the goal is to maximize likelihood of being accepted. It's not about the question of whether undergraduates belong on the panel or whether or not that's a good substantive reason. But I would not stray too far away from active professional academic as members of the panel. I would do an undergraduate or a activist, probably not both. But these are hard to talk about in the abstract. So the conclusion is, I wouldn't rule that out, but I don't think that's the best. That's not the structure that's going to maximize the likelihood of acceptance, not knowing anything else about the panel.
I mean, I would add to that by saying I did put in a panel for AAS many years ago now, maybe in 2015 or 2014, in which I wrote in an undergraduate who had just graduated, but I knew was going to Emory on a full ride for their MA and PhD in anthropology. So I knew that by the time we actually got to the AAS, they would have been in the first year of their master's degree, and they had done a double capstone project at NIU, one in anthropology and one in history that I'd advised them for both. I kind of knew them, and there definitely are, advanced undergraduates who are capable of original research, and just having undergraduate status should not be a reason to exclude them from a panel. It's just, I think graduate students who have not presented at a major conference before already feel kind of a lot of pressure and nerves. And I think it's even possibly worse for undergraduates. But I think definitely Tom is right. It's a case-by-case basis, and you have to use your best judgment. There's nothing wrong about including an undergraduate as long as you're sure of their capability and the appropriateness of featuring them on the panel.
If I could add to that, one thing to keep in mind if you're going to have probably not an issue with the activists with MA background, but sometimes we have non-academics on our panels. And as well as undergraduates, if you're working with them, which I haven't been with an undergraduate on the panel, but I've helped them get into smaller conferences, they are going to require a little bit more hands-on assistance with the basic mechanics of what the conference organizers are going to be looking for on their abstracts, which is something to keep in mind. You might have to work with them a little bit more than, say, that full professor is going to know exactly what they need. You might be, everyone working to shift things a little bit to fit together, but they know how to do an abstract. With an undergraduate, you're basically teaching them, likely for the first time, how to do a conference abstract. If it's a non-academic activist, similar often. And the other thing I was going to say, which the more beat me to on the messages, if you have undergraduates that are looking to get into, say, like AAS, I would suggest steering them towards a regional AAS. Even if this panel that you have, which is really dependent on where everyone's located, they might be traveling for a large AAS, but they're not willing to travel for a regional. But say if everybody was in, the Midwest, you could do the Midwest Regional AAS, you could do, the Southwest Regional AAS, the New York one. You could do the same panel at a regional AAS and do it at the larger AAS. And you could even have the same panel, for an example, with an undergrad at the regional and then without the undergrad at the larger one. You can have variations. So if you work it a little bit, I think it is very wise to ease undergraduates and early stage grad students into these. My first conference was not AAS or another large one. I did the regional circuit. I did smaller conferences. And ideally, those are the ones that, 3 people watched me fall apart instead of 50 people. Because it sucks when your first one's big and everyone sees that you don't know what you're doing. And it's true. Even though I felt very prepared for that, come the Q&A session, I realized that those papers were not that good. And I was not prepared. But going through the stages helped me become prepared. So it is very healthy to help undergrads with this, but just keep in mind the extra work and maybe steps that you might need to take. Yes, and Trude types in having an undergraduate research poster as a counterpart to your panel. If your conference does that, that's also another great idea. And it gets their foot in the door as well. And sometimes they might be able to get funding depending on their university and department. If they had like a poster connected to you, you might be giving them an in to get funding to go to a conference for the first time. So I think there's a lot of positive there. Do we have any other questions before we move into breakout rooms? All right, so just kind of go over again on the breakout rooms. We're going to move into 4 rooms. I think it'd be a great idea for everyone to introduce themselves, kind of let them know what they're thinking about for a presentation and so forth. And ideally, we might be able to find some partners for a potential panel.